Media Seeker. You ever hear that?
Oh, I haven't heard of that one. No. Yeah, yeah. Was that the camera brand for them?
Yeah,
Or
Media
yeah.
Seeker, and I think they were known especially for large format.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
I had a 35 of that.
Yeah, I have one of my buddies shoots on large format film and stuff like that. He likes it. And you can buy large format, mirrorless cameras. We don't sell them, but they're
Mirrorless, really?
yeah, mirrorless. They do make large format mirrorless, but they're
Really?
super expensive. Probably like the average around like $10,000, I would say, for just the body, no lens or
Although
anything.
I've
So,
seen the prices of some Leicas.
yeah.
The little ones, the Leicas, they're like 8,000.
Yeah, I mean you can, and I don't even think Leica makes a full format mirrorless camera, but even like their old film stuff, like their old rangefinders, you still find those for $1,000, $2,000, $3,000.
Right.
Like they hold their value. I mean they're great. So.
The lenses are fantastic.
Oh yeah, well they're so sharp. I really like the color that you get out of those Leica cameras and stuff. They look really nice. So, but. Hello everybody on the chat. My name's Aaron. We'll get started up here in a few minutes. If you were here last week, Saxon is on his little adventure into Europe right now, so I'll be teaching advanced photography today. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and I'll answer them as best as I can, or I'll give you an answer right when we're done with the class. So we'll give it like another minute or so if anybody tends to walk in here, but then we'll get started right away. So this one should be a little bit quicker than the other ones if you haven't been to them yet. So
That one lady usually comes in.
yeah, there's like I expect that one lady to pop in
She
here
comes
maybe.
in about 10 minutes later.
Yeah.
I don't know where I come from Highland Park.
Oh really? Yeah.
So it's
Yep.
still a long ride.
Yeah. Right.
No quick way of getting here.
I mean, I don't judge. I come from Rogers Park every day, so it's a few minutes late.
There's
That's
no quick way of getting here from Rogers Park.
right. Yeah.
It's
yeah.
all overland.
Yeah, and it's like if you're trying to get here, there's like traffic or there's like construction. Like every single route I have to take to get here right now. So let's see.
And it's a long ways from Rogers Park.
Right.
Farther than Highland Park.
Yeah. Yeah. It takes me about like 30 to 45 minutes to get to work every day. So.
Today I got here like in 23 minutes or so, which was really weird. And it's rush hours.
Right. All right. So. We'll go ahead and get started here. Let me switch it over to presenter view. Let's see, we got that going here. Oh, let's see if I can. Presentation, screen capture. Oops. Let me get this fixed real quick. I don't know why that's not popping up here. Hold on one moment while I get this set up. Put this on. Why is presentation view not working? This is what we're gonna do. We'll just get a capture screen on. That'll work for today. Here we go. It'll look a little funky for people watching, but they'll get the idea. All right. So today we're going to be talking about advanced photography. So this will be about what you do after you take your photos. So starting off, I know you're a little bit familiar with it. We're going to talk about JPEGs versus shooting in RAW. So on the left side of the photo, we have a RAW photograph. Our JPEG is in the middle, and what we completed with our RAW photo is processed on the far right. So basically, the way I like to explain like RAW or JPEG photographs, I'm going to use cake as an analogy. So if let's say I make you go to the kitchen and tell you to make me a cake. A RAW photograph is kind of like making a cake from scratch. So whatever you do while you're making that cake, you get to manipulate a little bit more. If I want to add in a little bit more sugar, a little bit more flavor, things like that. That's something that I'm allowed to do with my raw photo. It lets me change more of the qualities with it after I'm done shooting the photo. While
Good job with white balance.
white balance will have an effect with what you do with shooting in RAW, which we'll talk about white balance a little bit later. But yeah, white balance will be a bit different from when you're shooting in RAW or shooting in a JPEG. So your JPEG would be like if I had you go to Walmart, had you buy a cake. So while I'm shooting my RAW photograph, I might be able to make like red velvet or carrot cake or whatever. But if I go to Walmart, I might only have a couple options where I have vanilla or chocolate. So with that JPEG, like once you shoot it, you're kind of done with it. You can still edit it a little bit, but it's not going to let you do as much with it. It's not as flexible. Now, so you can kind of see there a little bit on the right. It's a little bit more controlled. It's a bit more kind of contrasty because we were allowed to edit with it a little bit later, right? And so if we were going down to the nitty gritty of what makes a JPEG versus a RAW file, JPEG is going to be a lot more compressed. Do we have someone looking maybe? No? Okay. A JPEG is going to be a more compressed file, right? So it's going to be a little bit more accessible. It's not going to take in as much storage, for instance, right? So that's actually one thing I don't agree with on the slides. Like a JPEG might be around 2 to 6 megabytes, but depending on your what type of camera you have, it's going to depend on what's in the picture. For instance, how many megapixels you have. A RAW photo, I'd say around like at 12 megapixels, which is pretty low. That's probably going to shoot, give or take, around like 26 megabytes. While if you have something a bit higher, like 24, 40 megapixels, like my iPhone, which can shoot 48 megapixels, that takes almost like 100 megabytes when I shoot on RAW, right? So it's like that's one thing to kind of be aware of when you're taking photos. I like to think like if you're in a more professional setting or you just want to show like your wife or kids the photo you took really quickly, it's nice to have a JPEG, and I'm sure you can shoot both at the same time just to take up more storage. So sometimes it's nice to have both, so you have those options. But when you have an uncompressed file like you do with RAW, it's keeping all of the original data. It's not like manipulating it or stripping it of any of its quality, so you have a little more to work with, like I mentioned. Another thing to bring up is going to be color bit, which isn't something you're going to be thinking of that much, right? You won't really have to. When you shoot on JPEG, you'll have a lower color bit than you do on RAW. Good afternoon, how are you? You didn't miss much. Just to give you a recap, I mean, we just started just talking about JPEGs versus RAW. I'm saying like a RAW photograph is going to be like, if I had you make a cake for me, you can make me any type of cake, red velvet, carrot, whatever, while my JPEG might be like going to Walmart and I only have vanilla or chocolate. It's pre-made, right? So a RAW photograph is going to let you manipulate those qualities a lot more, give you a bit more flexibility, as opposed to the JPEG, which once it's done, like, might be able to add my candles and my little signature or whatnot, but like JPEG, you're not going to manipulate it that much. A RAW, that's definitely made to like edit in full, right? So actually, let me close this door real quick, because I forgot to do that. You're going to have, like I said, you're going to have your compressed and then you're going to have your uncompressed file type. So compressed is just letting you get that really quick. You will be losing kind of like the original info you get out of the photograph, as opposed to uncompressed, which is letting you give all those qualities, your own manipulation, whatever you want to do with it. I was saying, I don't agree with the slides here, but with RAW, you will have a much larger file size, I will say, than what it says. If you're shooting like a 12 megapixel photo or something like that, you'll actually probably be looking more around like maybe 26 megabytes, right? So double, I'd say what that says. If you're looking at something like 24, 48, something like that or more, my iPhone, I can shoot on RAW. That'll, depending on what's in the scene, will adjust to how much megabytes that RAW photo will take up. But you know, my iPhone can take like 100 megabytes depending on what's in the scene.
So if it's like landscape, it'll take up more?
Yeah, I would say if there's more stuff in the scene, like more landscapes and things like that, just more details and stuff for it to pick up on, expect like a bit of a higher raw megapixel photo, while if I just put someone in front of a backdrop maybe that's like, you know, white or red or whatever else, might not be that much in comparison, right?
Well, what would be the reason, besides taking up space, not to always shoot it raw?
Sometimes, I mean, even me, like, I love to edit my photos, but sometimes I'm like, I really don't want to mess with this right now. So if I don't want to go through, like, you know, all the editing process of adjusting my photo and making it look a bit better, like, that's when I'll shoot a JPEG. But typically, I mean, editing is my niche, so I love to, you know, mess around with the photos when I'm done with them. But otherwise, like, I'd probably put them on both, have it shoot in RAW and JPEG, and, you know, just buy more SD cards or whatever. But what I was going to talk to you next was about color bit. So most of the cameras that people are going to buy are going to be at what's called like 10 color bit. And your bit, like to explain what a bit is, it's basically a computer recognizing like your info of the file in like ones and zeros, right? And so the higher color bit you have, the more colors it can adjust. So if you had a color bit of 1, it's basically useless because it only knows black and white, and so you're not going to be able to see anything. Your photo will look like big black and white squares. It doesn't have a gradient. When you have, for instance, 8 color bit, if you want to get really technical, math is involved, and you'll take it 2 to the 8th power, right? And so I know that 8 color bit is going to give me around a range of 256 colors, right? Now, as opposed to most of the cameras, I think that most of what you have is probably 10-bit color. That will give you around like 1,000 colors in that space. If you have like the Sony R series, for instance, the Sony R series is rated for 14-bit color, which gives you like 16,000 colors. Now, that being said, the human eye can only really recognize 10-bit color. So you're like, okay, so why do I need 14-bit color if I can't even see it? In reality, like if I just showed you a JPEG with 8-bit color, you'll notice it looks perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with it. It's perfect at our eye. But if we started to kind of like adjust and edit our photos and adjust the qualities, and maybe I adjust my exposure a little bit and my vibrance, which I'll talk about later, right? Now I'm going to notice all these little imperfections because my photo couldn't pick up all the other colors that are missing, right? So once you get into editing, that's when the higher color bit stuff works. But really, like, unless you're professional, what you guys have is perfectly fine. Just important to know that JPEGs versus RAW will, you know, produce different bit color. Okay.
I'm an R4, so what is that?
You would have 14-bit color. So you will have like plenty of flexibility in terms of if you're editing your photos, the color that you have. So you would get like that 16,000, you know, number that I quoted. So another thing, and I didn't actually know this before I came up here, but with JPEGs you can slap them in any photo editor, do whatever you want. But with RAW, you can't actually adjust them in every single photo editor. Now, there's 4 that we recommend. There's just 2 that I'm going to talk to you about because I think that's worth looking at. I don't know as much about the rest. But when you're editing with RAW, technically every camera manufacturer has a different type of RAW file type. So they're still RAW photos, but they're toggled a bit differently. And if you have like a really small like photo editing company, you know, they have to, you know, enable the software to work with all these different file types, so they don't always work. Now, if you're using the core ones, like I'll talk about, they're fine, but like a Canon camera is gonna have CR2 at the end of it for its RAW files. You have Nikon, that's gonna be NEF, yep. And for your Sony, like I also have Sony, it's ARW, right? Beyond that, I mean, simple as that, JPEG can be transferred faster, which is another thing as well.
Also, if you buy the latest and greatest camera, none of the editing places may have the ability to pick up the new RAW.
Potentially, yeah, if they kind of update and change things and stuff as they go. Like if Sony don't even know what they'd come up with, but if they move past mirrorless and there's something greater, they'll have to adjust to that new file type that they would have. So But yeah, I mean, beyond that, no editing, no point, manipulating, see differences, yeah. So now that we covered, how to make the camera take a picture, obviously once you're done with the photo, we're gonna edit our photos, which I skipped the tab. But these are kind of the editing softwares that, most people are editing photos are gonna look at. Saxon recommended Capture One Pro and Coral Paint Shop Pro, which I don't know as much about. I personally recommend Photoshop and Lightroom. And I wrote down some of the prices for you guys, just in case you're wondering how much they were. What most people are going to want to buy is called the photography plan. The photography plan is a really nice value because for like 20 bucks a month, you get Photoshop, you get Lightroom, and you get Lightroom Classic. Lightroom Classic is a bit more, I'd say more complicated than Lightroom. Normal Lightroom's a more dumbed down version of Classic, and people have been editing photos for years and years like these are the Classic version. But for 20 bucks, it is an annual subscription, so I do warn people that sign up for Adobe. Once you sign that trial, you're locked in for a year, even though it's $20 a month. So I've made that mistake plenty of times. It's like, oh, well, now I want to cancel. And you'll have to spend like $100 to, end your term or whatever. Now, if you are a teacher or if you're a student, you can actually get, it's called the Adobe Creative Cloud, which gives you all of the apps that you would need. That will give you, it'll still give you Photoshop, Lightroom, and Lightroom Classic, but you also get all the other Adobe products, every single one they make. So that would be like Premiere Pro, if you're gonna video edit. That's gonna be like Adobe Illustrator, if you like to draw, other apps like that, but those are kind of the core other stuff, which typically, if you just bought stuff singularly, it's like 20 bucks a month. The Creative Cloud subscription, if you wanted all the apps and you're not a teacher or student, is like 57 bucks, which is pretty pricey. But if you are a student or a teacher, it's like only 20 bucks a month. So it's the same as the photography plan. So if you do, that's one thing I recommend. But some people ask, oh, should I use Photoshop to edit my photos? Should I use Lightroom to edit my photos? At the end of the day, they're both gonna do really similar things. So, in my preference, when I'm going to edit my photos and stuff, I go into Lightroom. And the reason I go into Lightroom is depending if you buy that $20 plan, the photography plan, it gives you a terabyte of storage. If you don't want the cloud storage, because the nice thing with that, it gives you another place to back it up. So if you already have your photos on your SD card and you have some on your drive, and now you have it in the Adobe Creative Cloud and you have a terabyte of that, that means that if I delete them off my SD card, right, now I lost them there or something, or if my hard drive got corrupt and it's busted and I dropped it and it broke, at least I have the cloud that I have with Adobe that backs up every single one of my photos. Now they do have a cheaper plan, it's like 10 bucks, still gives you the same programs, but it's only like 30 gigs, and that's gonna fill up really quick, right? Both of these tools have like really nice like AI features and things like that, so like what Saxon brought up last week. If you go into Photoshop, I like to think that's where like my core manipulation of the photo is, right? Where if I'm wanting to add people in or subtract stuff out like really quickly, they have tools where you can just select something and change the whole background. Lightroom, I like.
looked for that in Lightroom. I didn't see it. I didn't ask.
In Lightroom, they have, it's gonna be under like your masks and things like that. So it's not the same as Photoshop. Photoshop is where you can add stuff that wasn't there at all, right? So I could expand the canvas. Like if I took a photo of Vincent van Gogh, right, and I wanted to see like what's on the side of the photos, Adobe Photoshop would be able to just add random stuff in that they think would look cool, right? While Lightroom is going to work with the existing properties of the image. So it can automatically detect, like I edited a photo like a week ago, and normally if I wanted to just brighten me or whoever's in the photo of the portrait, right, I would have to manually go through and mask myself. Now Lightroom is a lot smarter, so it can just detect a person and select that as a mask. Same with the background or other properties. So if I wanted to change the color of this guy from blue to pink, I just have to click on the button, adjust the slider, and it's really quick and easy. So, to dumb it down, I think Lightroom's a bit simpler, just kind of shows you everything you need. And as well, if you're gonna put like filters or anything like that on there, I think they just have a better option of filters. I've noticed, for me, I always thought Photoshops were a bit weird, right? So next, just talking about like some of the examples of these photos. These are all stuff that's like edited after they shot it. For instance, if we're looking at the baby, like in the bottom corner, right? Like not a super, like some of these aren't super noticeable differences, some more than others. The baby, like what I can tell you there is they might have like selected the half side of the baby's face, maybe by like drawing a circle on the side of it and brightening the like exposure of its face. So that way it just looks a little bit more like innocent or nicer and things like that, because shadows are meant to be a bit more dramatic and edgy and things like that. And while we're looking at the top left photo with the guy with the girl, I would say perhaps like, I would say he probably cranked the vibrance up on that photo just to get the colors to pop more, as well as making the photo a bit warmer. Now we'll talk about warm versus cool in terms of color temperature and white balance and things like that in a bit, but I can tell that's something they did there. Now if I was looking perhaps at the bottom right photo, I think that's a really good example of a raw photograph, because you can kind of tell on the left it's a bit more washed out and everything looks flat. Everything's going to look really flat when you shoot a raw photograph. Now you can see the steps they did to make it just a little bit more lively and things like that by kind of boosting the color and working with the brightness and things. Her skin looks a bit smoother to me as well, so they might have put a little bit of blur on the image as well, I would suspect. And then our top right photo is like an even more dramatic version of that. So with the photo in the top right, I can see that, you know, I would probably say that they also probably worked with like the saturation. Another thing we'll talk about in a little bit. I think it's important to not overly saturate your photos over the time, because that's what a lot of people do, because our eyes, we love color. And so the first thing we do is once we crank it up a little bit, we're like, okay, that looks really good, and then we crank it up more, and we're like, oh my God.
I did too much stuff to some of my photos. I was messing around. I was told, don't.
Yeah.
Don't.
Right, and there's always like, it can be very tempting. There's lots of good YouTube videos and stuff like that to talk about it online, but sometimes you can get an even better photo just by even kind of like bringing down the colors a bit to bring it a bit more muted. Things like your color and your shadows are going to affect the mood of the image, whatever you're trying to make. So I think that's always something good to kind of think about.
I was told to cut the contrast.
They cut the contrast. Yeah, it's like, I mean, I've done it before too, plenty of times where I go in and I just bump that contrast up, because it's like, I don't know, it's kind of fun a little bit, because you're like seeing all these changes happen at once, but then you go back and you look at the changes and you're like, yeah, that is a little bit intense. I should calm down a little bit, but.
I just go by what it looks like to me. I'll change it and then I'll look at it.
And that's a problem too, because maybe I don't know what looks right.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, at the end of the
looks good to you.
Yeah, at the end of the day, that really is what editing is. It's whatever you think, looks the best. So.
But my initial question is, it doesn't print that way all the time.
Yeah, right. Which is then like,
That's the
depending on
problem.
what type of printer you're looking at, that's when like if you bumped it up too much, depending on what printer you're doing, they'll boost it too much. So, but now we're going to talk about kind of cleaning up your photos. So like one of the first tools we're going to talk about is crop, right? So crop is a nice tool for when you originally take a photograph, right? Sometimes you want to mess with that framing a little bit later. And obviously when you crop a photo, you will be losing out on a bit of your megapixels or your sharpness or whatever else. Not a huge deal, I would say compositionally. You want to kind of worry about that more first than losing out. I crop in on my photos all the time, and they still come out nicely and things like that once they're done. Even if you have a 24 megapixel camera at the low end, I mean, you'll still have plenty to work with when you're cropping.
So when you shoot a raw and you convert it from Adobe or whatever, you crop it, you're still losing?
Yeah, like at the end of the day, like your computer is going to recognize how many megapixels your photograph was, whether that's 12, 24, 48, 60, whatever, right? And basically that 60 megapixels, for instance, is spread across the entire camera. So the more I crop in, the more I'm kind of losing out. Think of it almost as digital zoom on your phone, right? So like I have a new iPhone, right? And I can zoom in 5 times crystal clear, right? And it's going to look fine. But even though I have that option, I can zoom up to 25 times. But if I zoom up to 25 times, my photograph's going to look a little bit more blurry. Kind of works the same way. Now, I'll say that when you're cropping, you're probably not going to be like doing super dramatic stuff, like no more than what they did in this photo, right? So you're not going to be really losing out on that much unless you were cropping in like really small for some reason. Now, the first thing you're going to do when you crop is to make sure it's straight. That's a really easy thing. So, you know, sometimes when you're out shooting, you don't always get a level. And some of like even I would say, I think Photoshop, but I know Lightroom also just has an automatic straightener tool if you just want to get done quick and easy. After that, one thing you want to do is get rid of that negative or dead space, which they also talked about I think a week or 2 ago. Now I will say that doesn't mean you can never have dead space. Photography's an art form, and there's plenty of use cases, especially in popular media, where the use of dead space, if you know how to use it properly, can still make your photos look really good. If you watch movies, like I know there's some, if I could edit the slides a little bit more, I'd show you like there's some Wes Anderson cinematography where they use a lot of dead space a lot of the time, where you have a person at the bottom half of the screen and you see more of the landscape in the back. At the end of the day, it's just all about the photo, the feeling you're trying to focus on. So when I'm looking at that photo on the left-hand side, I'm not really, even though that person's in the center of the photo, I'll say it's a bit kind of generic, boring photo, right? What draws me into the photo is more of the landscape. I'm seeing more of the world that this girl is in and less on the girl herself, right? Now, if I was doing kind of like maybe a fun little family vacation photo, I want to say like, hey, look at my girlfriend and she's, you know, canoeing or whatever they're doing, right? Then that's where that photo on the right, I'd say provides more of a, you know, emphasis on her as opposed to the landscape, right? So we're focusing more on her and the canoe versus the landscape itself and this girl that's also in the canoe. Another thing you'll notice, we talked about our rule of thirds and stuff like a week or 2 ago. The nice thing about cropping in is we have her lined up along the right side of the rule of thirds, so her head kind of, her head or her neck kind of intersects in the top right corner, and then her body flows down into the right, and then we have our ocean over the horizon line. So overall, I would say the right is a more interesting photo, but it depends on what you want to do. The last thing we're going to talk about in terms of kind of touching up the photos is oftentimes when we take our photos, especially if they're at water or something, they might have like some water droplets on their lens or things like that, and that's a really easy one to clean up and post. It's kind of hard to see, but like if I look on the left-hand side, there's some spots here and there. As faint as they are, all you have to do is go in with your brush tool and you can just touch those up really quickly. Very easy to use. So now we'll talk a little bit about white balance. So with white balance, it's really talking about the overall color tone of the photo, right? And so most of your cameras are going to do it automatically, so you don't really have to worry about it. I will say it's something you need to pay a little bit more attention if you're shooting like video, and like you're maybe like in a movie studio or something like that, and you're shooting on multiple days, right? Because if I'm shooting on one day at a certain time, I need to make sure the white balance is the same as what I'm doing on another day, right? If I use auto, it might not be the same every time, and I'll notice the differences in my cut, right? So color, I mean, just something that's not on here. Color temperature is measured in a measurement called Kelvin, you might have heard of before, right? So if I had a candle on the table or something like that, right, it's going to produce a warmer tone. The smaller the Kelvin number, the warmer it is, the higher the number, the more bluish it's going to look, right? So if I'm shooting indoors, like right now, something that has incandescent lights or something like that, that's going to be at around 2600 Kelvin. Or, yeah, I think it's Kelvin. Now I have to think. But we're going to say it's Kelvin, even if it's not.
We'll trust.
Yeah, it's all about the confidence. So something like inside is going to be around like 2600 Kelvin or so. It's a bit warmer look, right? Now, if I walked out, especially today, when it's like super cloudy out and things like that, it's going to have a bit more of a bluish hue to it. bluish tint. So if I was out, you know, I'd say like cloudiness, I think I wrote, is around like 5,000 Kelvin, and your blue sky, like perfect blue sky, is gonna be around 25,000, right? And so the nice thing is with your camera is that most of the time it's gonna adjust for those little imperfections, right, automatically. If you did have it in some manual mode that wasn't doing that and you wanted to do it automatically, you just need to compensate for that, right? Beyond that, once you go into your editing program, you'll have a couple different things. You're gonna have your temperature and your tint. So if it is a little bit off and you're like, oh, it looks really blue right now. The nice thing is they all give you that adjustment in the photo editor, so you can crank it so it's a bit more warm and a bit more blue. That way you can get that true white point, which is what we call that even distribution, where it's not too warm, not too light, right? Now, that doesn't mean that you never want to make a photo look warm or blue. I like to think that, you know, warmer photos are going to look a lot more friendly and inviting. So sometimes in like maybe more family photos, depending on where it's set, I like to make them just a bit more warmer. The iPhone is, I wouldn't say notorious, but famous for, you know, making a bit more warmer photos because our eyes like a bit more of a warmer color. While maybe if I was shooting a photo of like a cityscape or something like that, a more industrial look, something like blue, it gives more a colder feeling as opposed to like a more inviting feeling. So I was gonna say beyond that, I mean, if you ever notice a camera and you're like, why does it look so blue? Why does it look so red or whatever? You just need to kind of adjust your white balance. One thing that's important to know is that our eyes, right, make stuff up for us. So when we go into a room, like if I go on the train, if I go on the CTA downtown, we have these really ugly fluorescent lightings in the whole building, right? Or in the whole train. And so when you go in, it's just gonna look like normal lighting. But if I took out a photo or whatnot, I've seen it happen before, that doesn't really process stuff, it's gonna turn up a little bit greener. You're gonna be like, it didn't look green. It's because our eyes just filter it out. We do that all the time. Your camera is more literate, so it doesn't always make things up, which is, you know, important to recognize. So the last thing with kind of your color balance is going to be your tint. So tint is kind of used, I'd say, after you adjust the temperature. You can do either interchangeably. That you're going to mostly use, I would say, to kind of fix up skin tones. It's going to adjust the more of the greenish color, the magenta color of this color spectrum, which you kind of get as a result from either making your photo too warm or too blue or whatever else. So yeah, and I mean also, it's a given the light changes throughout the day, so white balance will be different at different times. So
when I work with white balance, it sort of asks me as shot, it asks me cloudy,
yeah,
it asks
right.
me, so those are the choices I have.
Right.
Now by manipulating the temperature, will that make it a little bit different as well?
Kind of, yeah. It works in the same instance. Basically, that thing that's on your camera is like a little preset that it recognizes that, like, oh, it's cloudy, it's going to be this many Kelvin, right? And so it adjusts to that automatically. You don't need to mess with it. Now, if you put it on there accidentally and you're like, oh, like my color temperature was wrong, the white balance is off, you can fix that later. This is an easy thing that you can touch up.
I mean, I go a little crazy when I look at first thing I do is look at the different choices of white balance.
Yeah.
And I'm saying, well, as shot doesn't look as good as cloudy does.
Exactly. Yeah, I was gonna say as shot also is just kind of like an auto mode, like an everyday kind of go in and out. So I was gonna say oftentimes I will say that, you know, if you have those options and you can use them and it looks better, do what looks best.
But I don't believe myself.
Yeah, I know, I say the same thing to me too.
That's
but
why
you know.
Here, right?
But yeah, it's mostly just magenta and green is mostly just to fix color and balance that I recognize is usually with skin tones. So now this is kind of more simple stuff, terms that most people have probably heard or familiar with. So now you're going to have adjusting your exposure and your contrast. So exposure will play with how bright and dark the photo is, right? And exposure is something you can already do in your camera. Now, if you're shooting in manual mode, it still is important to make sure you get that exposure right or close to right, Because if it's really way off, your photo editor isn't going to be able to salvage it that much. But if you do it correctly, it still offers some use case once you're in post-production. So that would kind of let me get a little bit more of a dramatic feel or whatnot than maybe when I was shooting and I wasn't too worried about that. Now, your contrast is going to play a little bit differently. So it's still talking about the brightness or the darkness. I would say exposure applies to the whole overall part of the photo, just making things overall darker, lighter, right? While contrast is going to play with both your dark and light tones. So the higher contrast you have, the darker things are going to get, and the brighter things are going to get, right? So your dark things are going to get emphasized darker, and your light things are going to get emphasized lighter. Hence the term contrast. It just looks a little bit more poppy. So, I mean, the right is a great example of someone that underexposed their image, and then I would say something like that, you could probably still crank it up a little bit, fix it in post, and get kind of that middle photo. Or even if you overexpose, bring it down a little bit.
I think that is how some of mine look when I play with the contrast.
Yeah.
It pushes it too far.
Right. I was gonna say, like, sometimes it's not bad. Like, I mean, the photo on the left, I would say they definitely did a lot of editing. I would say with the one on the left, you don't get a lot of details out of the shadows and things like that and whatnot. It's kind of a little bit more blown out. Once we I think we probably bumped our exposure a bit. I wouldn't be surprised if it did a little bit of contrast, but then you get to see a little bit more of the mountainscape, right? Kind of same thing with the one on before and after on the left with the mountains. So, and this isn't something that I personally use that much, but it is kind of like a good tool to see. Maybe if your color correction is correct. So this is called a histogram, and like I said, you don't always need to use it when you're editing photos, but it's nice to see your distribution of light. So when you're looking at a histogram, the left side of the histogram is going to indicate how dark my photo is, right? While the right-hand side of my histogram is going to show you the light parts, the really like white, bright parts of my photo. Now, if we're working vertically, right, in the tone of the graph, it's going to tell me how much of that specific tone, that specific lightness, is present in the image, right? So this is like a pretty good example of a histogram. It's not going over the edges or anything like that. But I was going to say, that brings me into the next slide, which gives us a few examples of what to look for and what not to, right? So if you're looking at the photo on the right side, this is when we're going to talk about something. It's called clipping, right? Clipping is going to be when I'm looking at my histogram and all of a sudden it's going off the chart, right? If I'm clipping, I'm losing out on detail in my image, and we never want to clip, right? So the photo on the left was done poorly because now it's clipping onto the brightness part of my photograph. So now I'm not seeing any detail in the sky. It's also kind of blowing out some of the highlights on my building and things like that as well. A properly exposed image like the one in the middle, right, is done perfectly fine because I still have my highlights, my kind of brighter contrasty parts in the image, as well as the shadows that are still present. Now, when we're looking at the building on the farthest right, we can see that we're kind of getting to the point of clipping, but I was like, you can still sort of see little bits of it, but it's definitely underexposed. It's starting to lose detail in the shadows and things like that. And the right photos are good examples of, different styles of photography and what to look for. The bottom right is a really cool photo to look at because we can see that, since there's a lot of white color present in the image, I can see that my highlights are going to be a lot higher on the histogram as opposed to my shadows because they're not really there. They kind of start to trickle off a bit more. The top right photo with the shadows, we can kind of see that, has the reverse effect where the shadows kind of play into kind of like I'd say the photo's interesting because it draws me in a little bit more to the trees, right? Now I'm not as focused on like the background and things like that. Same with the bottom left. You could say the bottom left one is clipping, but it was definitely like intentional in the sense that like, I mean, it's at nighttime. We don't really want to see the details on the tree or the grass or anything like that at this time of day. The silhouette is arguably what makes this photo more interesting and kind of draws you more into the sky, right? Which is where we get those brighter points in the image. And then the left is, top left is going to be your more kind of typical, I don't know, everyday solution for like when you're taking photos midday. You get a little bit of the whole cast. You still get some shadows, you still get some bright parts. So.
Would that be considered clipping?
In the top left?
Yes.
With this one is not clipping because...
No, I'm sorry, the top right.
Oh, top right. Top right is like on the verge of clipping a little bit. With that one, I mean, since we're messing with the shadows, I mean, at the end of the day, even if they cranked it a little more, you couldn't see the trees. I don't think that's a bad example. But what you'll see when you're clipping sometimes is that you'll start to get these weird like pixely blobs and things like that. And you'll notice them, especially if you shoot on, print the photos out. So it's like right now, like when I look at this photo, I don't really see any of kind of like these pixely grids in the black where I'm losing the detail. So they did it just fine. But if they pushed it a bit more, then it would be, yeah. All right. So now we're going to talk about vibrancy and saturation, which also confusing terms, and they seem like one and the same, but they do different things. And some of the info's wrong on the slide too. Saturation, to make it very simple, saturation is going to increase basically, I would say, all the color in the image. So when I adjust my saturation slider, and all those reds and oranges are going to be brought up at the same level as like my greens and my whites or whatever, right? Now, that is one thing, like I mentioned, saturation is usually the first thing we go for. And I will say that if you're looking just to get a bit more color out of your image without looking goofy or anything like that, try to mess more with vibrancy first. If you notice that your photo has some spots where the color is like pleasant, but some of them look a bit more flat, the vibrancy is gonna increase the less saturated aspects of your photo, but kind of keep those really high saturated parts that are already in the photo kind of around the same, right? So in this photo, if I increase my vibrancy, right, on the left-hand side of the landscape, vibrancy might just pick up a bit more green out of the grass as opposed to changing the whole canvas. So when I adjust vibrancy, it's going to adjust probably green the most, and then maybe just a tad bit of the sky, but not a whole lot. Now if I do saturation, it's going to increase my green and it's going to increase my orange at the same rate, which is when we kind of get like a photo more so like this, right? And sometimes you want to play with bringing down the vibrancy. So, you know, if I didn't want my dog to have like a goofy little pink tongue like this, and I wanted to look a little more, I don't know, I don't want to say industrial, but you can kind of see how mood kind of affects when you use vibrancy or saturation in different ways. So.
The one at the top is what?
Yeah, the one on the top right is minus 100 vibrance. The one on the bottom is plus 100. And I wouldn't really say that either one is bad. I would say this is probably the least desired photo. But it's just definitely a different mood. I feel like this one, having less vibrance, makes it feel a bit more serious, while more vibrance makes it a bit more friendly, right? If I was watching The Dark Knight, I wouldn't want my vibrancy at 100. I'd probably want to crank it down a little bit or something, right? So, let me just see if there was anything I missed in here. We're going to start talking about video soon, light changes, tints, white balance, yeah, we went through all that stuff. Cool. Then we're going to talk about sharpness. This is usually the last thing you want to do in your photo, right? Because once you adjust your contrast and all this other stuff, sometimes they kind of fix themselves. So when you adjust the sharpness, it's going to bring out a little bit more definition out of your image. This photo specifically is a bit blurry, so it's hard to see, but typically you'll get, a bit more detail kind of throughout his fur and his whiskers and things like that. I'd say the one with the frog is the most noticeable. When you adjust sharpness, it's going to give you a bit more contrast to your eye. So it's just going to give you it's going to kind of lure you in a little bit more. Depending on what you're shooting, you're not going to always want to adjust sharpness because sharpness is also artificial. So if I was doing a portrait photography type photo, I don't always mess with sharpness that much. I try to limit myself and only dabble at like maybe 10 or 20 high. If I was doing something like an animal, like to get that kind of National Geographic look or whatnot, then maybe I'll adjust my sharpness a bit more of that than I do a person, right? So
I don't see the difference between the two.
it is kind of hard. You have to really look at it. Like when I look at this one, he just looks a bit more smoother. If I'm looking at this side, I can see he has a bit more texture.
Okay.
So all that texture that we kind of have on here is where that sharpness plays.
So it's not fixing, you'll never fix out of focus.
Well, yeah, you'll not really fix autofocus. So for instance,
Out of focus is sort of your dead.
yeah, if you messed up with the autofocus, you're kind of done. Like if for instance I took a photo and it's working on the background instead of the frog, there's not really a way to kind of fix that.
So
Now,
you're
like,
just tuning in the sharpness, that's all you're really doing.
yeah, you're tuning in on the sharpness. I will say that if you're shooting on like an iPhone and you shoot in portrait mode, since it's artificial, they can't actually give you a real bokeh or anything. They let you fix that in post, but anything shot out of your camera, I'm sure in the future that'll be something they'll let you do. But I was like, at this point in time, what you get is what you get, basically. So.
If you hadn't pointed that out, I didn't see it just by looking at it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very minuscule thing. I mean, even looking on my laptop computer, I don't really see much, right? But there is instances where you can tell it's like, oh, this person cranked the sharpness up way too much. It looks ridiculous.
Oh yeah.
Like I'm looking on like a Best Buy TV with their like motion smoothing Spider-Man videos or something. So, and now we'll talk about printing your images. Now, the way that, I mean, as I was kind of recommending, I mean, you can buy your own photo printers. I don't know much about photo printers themselves, so I'd ask somebody that knows a bit more about that. Just as you take the photos, when you print them out, they might change a little bit depending on the quality of the printer. I recommend if you want to go print your photos, still old school, they still do it, but Walgreens will print beautiful photos. I would do it before CVS. I was saying CVS is when I printed some at CVS and the saturation and the contrast looks janky to me compared to what my photo looks like.
I normally do Shutterfly.
Oh, you can do Shutterfly too. I haven't used that before, but I hear a lot about it. I think that's a good choice too. Now,
I do a lot of photo books.
oh yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, that's a really good option. I didn't even think about that. So, I mean, that would be an option in terms of like outsourcing and getting your photos done. I would do that. When you're talking about the size of the photos you want to take, most of you guys will be fine because I know you guys have decent megapixel cameras. The more megapixels you have, the more you will benefit from, the bigger photo. If I took a really low resolution camera that's 12 megapixels, for instance, your iPhone. An iPhone is a good example because up until recently, it's been 12 since like the first one, basically. Actually, I think they started lower on the first one, but they've been at 12 for like 10 years. If I was shooting a 12 megapixel photo and I blow it up to 20 by 24, I'm gonna really notice I'm like, this was shot on an iPhone, right? Because it's gonna look really blurry, right? But as long as you guys have like, let's say 24 or higher realistically, which you guys I know do, especially if you have the R, which is high enough, you can basically, print them just about as big as you want, right? Won't do like billboards or anything like that, but I don't expect, I guess, anyone to really do billboards that's walking.
I've done a few 13 by 19.
Oh, well, there you go, yeah. So, I mean,
would that be the same as canvases? Because I do canvases as well, so.
yeah, kind of in the same vein as that. And I mean, yeah, I think this one is like, I would just say if you have really low megapixel photos, you're going to be doing the top row. If you have higher megapixel, it's going to be the bottom, right? Beyond that, any more questions with printing photos, anything like that? No. So now we'll get probably into the boring stuff for you, the stuff I love, but
I've never done any of this.
I haven't either.
So,
And I know there's a button there, but that's all it is.
so I would say 90% of the people that come into here are not going to be doing videography, but it's still kind of important to understand how video works, videography works, all that stuff. So when you're doing videography, in the more consumer aspect of it, there's going to be 3 parts to our production process. There's going to be pre-production, which involves us planning everything out. If we're in a more like professional setting, we might get a script ready, we might get actors ready, things like that, like kind of get an idea of the world we're about to shoot, right? And then production is obviously, the stuff that we're shooting. So that's when we hit record on the camera, we have all our equipment out, we have people helping us getting in the photo, right? And post-production is when we pile all of those clips that we just shot and we turn them into something. Because until then, after production, a lot of people get the misconception that it's like, oh, production is what makes the film. This is what I'm going to see when I'm done, or my video. But really, once you're done with production, it's like I just threw you a 1,000-piece puzzle on the table and said, okay, here's your movie or your video, right? Editing is when you're finally going to kind of create and craft that thing that you just shot. So, then we'll talk about the different aspects to consider when you're shooting video, right? So we're going to have our video resolution, our ratio, and our FPS, which is our frames per second. To start off, we're going to talk about video resolution, which is also a little bit wrong, but close to right. So you're going to have, if you've ever bought a TV before, which everybody has, and their mothers and their grandmothers and whatever else, right? You'll probably have heard these terms thrown around at you, SD, HD, UHD, all this different stuff, and it's like, okay, what does all this mean, right? To start off, we have SD, standard definition, which isn't really prevalent that much anymore. That kind of stands for 480p, which is talking about kind of like the pixels we're going to get in the image at the end of the day, right? 480p looks pretty blurry. You're going to notice it's not very sharp. You're not going to see a lot of detail. Then you're going to move up to HD, which HD is actually going to be at 720p, which is what was on TVs for quite a little bit of a while, and you still see them straggling around on smaller TVs. Just like talking about megapixels in your canvas, resolution is going to be a big factor in what you're playing on your TV, right? So if you are on like a 20-inch TV, 30-inch TV, whatever, 720p is going to be more than sufficient at the end of the day, right? But if I'm starting to get into like my 40, 50, 60-inch TVs, that's when I definitely want to shoot for like 4K or something. 1080p, which is actually FHD, has been the most prevalent standard for years and years. And at the end of the day, a lot of people can't really even see the difference between 1080 and 4K. If one thing to also note is that when you load this video into your video editor, depending on what type of computer you have, your computer is going to handle that footage differently. So if I have a really cheap $200 computer and I try to throw 4K footage into it in Premiere, my computer is probably going to go haywire, and it's going to want to blow up, and it's going to get really hot, and it's going to be like, what are you doing, right? If I have something a bit more premium, right, that can process that footage a bit better, that's when it's like you can take advantage of 4K. But even with some premium computers, premium consumer computers, you'll notice it kind of starts to stutter a bit when you're doing 4K if you have a lot of footage. So if you are a casual user, there's definitely nothing wrong with just shooting at 1080 video. It'll still look fine. But as if you have the resources to do it, definitely recommend 4K. I told you FHD stands for 1080. 4K is basically like 1080p 4 times. It's like I split it down the middle, and there's 4 1080p screens in that same image. And then 8K is just a more absurd, I think it's probably 4K images scattered across the screen. So it's as sharp as you can really get right now. Most movies and things like that, I believe, are shot at around 8K resolution or higher, and then they just downsample it to like 4K or whatever you're watching on, right? The next thing we're going to talk about is your aspect ratio. Now, perhaps like maybe you open up Netflix. I've been asked this a lot, and I feel like it's a simple thing, but I go to film school, so not everybody knows. But sometimes people open up Netflix, or I'll show people here, and they're like, "Why are there black bars on the top of my TV? Where's all this image at?" Because people like to see stuff, right? But aspect ratio really lends itself into what the filmmaker or the videographer decided to shoot with, right? So there's going to be all these different aspect ratios. I mean, we put the really simple, bare bones ones that you'll probably work with the most if you decide to shoot video on your cameras. They usually give you like 3 or 4 options to choose between, right? But, video has been going on for well over 100 years, maybe 130, 140 years, and aspect ratios changed a lot. So, if you ever look at an old movie, you'll notice it's kind of like a bit more squared off aspect ratio. I believe old movies started in what was called 4:3 aspect ratio, which we do have here on the screen. 4:3 is going to take full advantage of your full frame sensor, right? This is going to be as close to like 35 millimeter film, which is what they shot with back in the day, right? Now, I would say one reason that aspect ratios exist is because once consumer TV started to become readily available to people, right? People stopped going to the movie theater because they're like, why should I go out to the movie theater and see exactly what I can see on my 5-inch TV screen, right? Which sounds a bit ridiculous. I'd rather see it on a bigger screen, but I mean, you can kind of understand that, if I can see a 4:3 image on my TV, why am I going to the movie theater to see the same thing and pay for it, right? So what happened is that they invented an aspect ratio called Cinerama in 1952. And Cinerama, while I don't think they use it much anymore, it's a weirder aspect ratio, it's going to be a lot closer to something like 16:9. And 16:9 is going to be more of that cinematic aspect ratio that you see when you watch most movies, action movies, shows, things like that, right? And the basic gimmick behind it was that they were like, oh, if we make them look different, people will come out to the movies. Because now, if you try to watch a 16:9 image on your TV, right, now you're going to have all these black bars on them, right? And now there's going to be like more of a reason to go back out to the movie. So that's the whole reason why aspect ratio exists, and I'm sure you've heard of like familiar terms like IMAX aspect ratio, things like that. IMAX ratio is IMAX aspect ratio is going to be the closest to 4:3. If you went and saw like Oppenheimer at the movie theater or something like that, they had this big publicity thing talking about shooting on 70 millimeter IMAX, right? And the nice thing with having the higher aspect ratio is it makes it a lot more immersive. It kind of transports you into the world. So if you go into an IMAX 70 theater, right, that big horizontal image is going to fill your whole field of view, right? And they'll switch back into more of a 16:9 aspect ratio for your conversations and things like that. So it kind of makes it, a little bit more focused on the discussion and the world, I would say, right? Beyond that, we'll talk about our FPS, which is also another thing that has evolved through the years, right? So when silent films first came around, I'd say silent films were shooting at around 12 to 14 FPS. It's still important to recognize that, we basically got everything figured out at this point, but it is probably photography and video is the newest art form out of all arts, right? So they were kind of experimenting with frames per second. It's quite simple, just how many frames are going to be shown to you in a second. The more frames, the smoother it is. And when we started off, we had so many different aspect ratios, like you go to a movie and everything was inconsistent. And then around, what was it, like it was in like 1920, 1930, I want to say. That's when you started to see a standard of 24 frames per second. Right, so whenever you go to the movies, if you watch a movie on TV, you're watching it at 24 FPS most of the time. That's an option that you have in all of your video cameras. You can usually toggle between 24, 30, 60, things like that, right? The reason why we shoot at 24 is that it's not stuttery like it is at 12, that it's kind of jarring, right? But it's not like super smooth that it looks like there's no movement. 24 gives you just a little bit of like motion blur, which is nice to kind of make things feel a little bit more faster paced, right?
What is the iPhones?
So iPhones will give you multiple options. So by default, I think I helped you change your settings like last week. Mm-hmm. By default, it'll usually shoot at like 30 frames a second, right? Which is fine. It's a bit smoother than 24. So I'd say it's good for like those kind of like everyday videos and whatnot. But if I was trying to shoot like a little mini movie or short film, I'd want to bump it down to 24, which gives me the option. What I do a lot of the time on my iPhone is I shoot at 60. I don't know what it is exactly for me, but 60 FPS video for just kind of like family videos and like fun photos and things like that, fun videos. I think it like makes more sense for the iPhone medium. Now, I'd say it's kind of like a no-go, like don't shoot your films in 60. Like if you're shooting a film for some reason, 60 just looks really weird. And filmmakers have been trying for years to change us like frame rate. I think they had, when The Hobbit came out originally, they had a 48 FPS cut and everybody hated it from what I heard. Most recently, James Cameron's new Avatar movie, The Way of Water, went between, I want to say 24 FPS to like 80 to 120 FPS, which kind of works, but it can be a little jarring if you're not used to it because all movies are shot in 24, and most TV shows I'd say are shot in 30. Most of the time, you can watch 60 FPS video. That's what most cheaper TVs are going to produce. They just have a 60 frames per second panel. They can't do more than that. If you're watching the news or you're watching sports, you'll notice it usually looks a bit smoother than if you watched a movie. Now, if you have a more expensive, higher-end TV, that's when you might notice 120 FPS sports videos. In the use case of your cameras or your phones, you're going to see 24, 30, and 60 just for shooting standard video. 120 or those high FPS frame rates are usually reserved for slow motion video. So on your iPhone, I think you can do like 240 FPS in slow-mo. And on your cameras, if you have a slow motion option, it's usually 120. And that's more frames per second, just makes it look smoother, like I said. And I guess a cool example of playing with frame rate, right, is if you watch, like there's some new animated Spider-Man movies or anything like that, they start the movie off at 12 frames per second, which once again hasn't been heard of in probably 60 to 80 years or whatnot. But the reason they did that is because it complemented the feeling of the movie. It was supposed to look and feel like a comic book. And so kind of making it a bit more stuttery made it look a little bit more cartoony, comic booky. Then as your main Spider-Man superhero becomes a hero throughout the story, then it changes the frame rate to 24 gradually. So then it becomes a little bit more immersive, so it kind of like lures you in. So it's kind of fun. And now we're kind of rolling into the back end of the presentation.
Okay.
We're going to talk about, when you're filming, there's important aspects to get right. I think Saxon says you want to have at least 2 of them right. If one of them's crappy, doesn't matter, but at least you have 2 to salvage from, right? First thing's going to be camera quality. Now, just like any form of art, there's good reasons to use like cruddy cameras and reasons to use really excellent cameras, right? So, I mean, I don't expect anyone to be making movies out of here or anything like that, but you know, that's something to accommodate. If you're going to be putting it on like a 300-inch screen, you're going to want to have a camera that can produce that type of image, right? I'm not going to shoot a video on my iPhone and play it on a 300-inch screen because it's going to look weird, right? But let's say I was maybe trying to create like a vintage scene in my movie or my video. Sometimes it helps to kind of have like to shoot with like some old $400 camcorder because it creates a feeling, you know, where sometimes you can't get that digital, right?
I had shot a movie on my camera, downloaded it to the computer, and it took me forever to find that movie.
To find it?
Yeah.
I was gonna say, that's always, yeah, I was gonna say, I will say, like, I mean, as someone that messes with computers and, you know, has to deal with getting footage or photos all the time, file management is just one big thing that is just a pain in the ass and no one likes to do it. It's just always important to kind of see where you're shooting that video at and whatnot. I will say one thing too, depending on the video, be ready to wait and sit there a bit longer than when you're transferring your photos. Your photos might take a few seconds, while your videos, if you shot like minutes and minutes of videos, a 4K video, you might be sitting there for a little while.
So that's what I have a question. If I shoot some video on the same card I'm shooting my photos, you stick the reader in, and where does it go?
So when you stick your
I use iPhoto.
when you use photos.
It's hard to find it.
Yeah, so when you're on a Mac and you put the SD card into your camera, you should see a little SD card icon pop in on your desktop screen, right?
Yeah, right.
And from there, once you click on that, you'll see all the photos, videos, things like that. Then it really depends where you're gonna move those photos and videos to. For me,
iPhoto loads them up on their own.
yeah, if you there's an option where you can like.
No, where's that go?
I found it like when I went on the card, I copied and pasted to like the pictures section, video
Yeah,
section.
you can kind of do it like that. I think if you right click on the photos you want to transport, I think you can like import them or something like that and choose where you're saving them to. And then if you go into your Photos app on your Mac, there should be a spot that says like export or something like that. When you click on that, you'll see all the photos that you loaded in like artificially that weren't like your iPhone or something. But there's other places you can save them. Like sometimes I like to, you know, make a desktop
But the
photo
video
or
doesn't.
Yeah, so
Video.
iPhoto, you say you want to load in the ones you haven't used before. You do, it just doesn't. Where does the movies go?
But the video doesn't go.
Where does that go?
I mean, you'd have to bring your computer in so I can see. I mean, from when
What happens to it?
I had to search. I searched it.
Did it get in the hard drive somewhere?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was gonna say, whenever I put my SD cards into, you know, my computer, I mean, often I just kind of like, you know, might drag and drop them into a folder or something like that.
Yeah.
The times that I have done video and I imported them, I can find them under my exports in my Photos app. But it probably just depends on, you know, what type of style you're doing it. Because there's always multiple ways to do something on the computer. So.
Well, I think what he's doing is what I did. It's like when you open up Photos and you have it set up, it'll automatically upload the photos that's on your
Yeah,
card.
I always put iPhoto on. I put it on first.
Okay.
Then I stick the card in, and it loads it into iPhoto.
But it doesn't load the video in there.
Oh, I gotcha.
And it used to have the older iMacs and stuff had that movie thing.
Yeah. And they
It
don't.
doesn't go to that anymore.
Huh.
No.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly where those might be ending up, but I mean, just to kind of speed through some of these, because we were talking about camera qualities and things.
Right.
Next, you're gonna have your lighting, right? And with lighting, for most of the stuff that you guys are shooting, it's gonna be just more kind of like in the real world. You're gonna be working with stuff, but when people are creating videos or creating movies, everything you see is fake. I was gonna say they have plenty of lighting rigs everywhere and things like that. But the basics to get good lighting are to have a key, a fill, and a backlight, right? And the backlight is nice to kind of separate your object from the background so they don't blend in as much, right? And the key light is like usually the first light that you're gonna like provide on a subject, and that's what kind of helps create a bit of definition and gives you some of that contrast, more of a dramatic look on the face. The fill light is gonna be used in kind of contrast to the key, and that is gonna let you kind of fill in a bit of the shadow. So it's not maybe clipping in your camera and kind of fills it up a bit, right? Then you're gonna have your microphones. 3 type of microphones we're really gonna deal with. There's gonna be the shotgun mic, which really in a way is kind of the on-camera mic for some people. It's just that little mic that you pop on the top. We call it like a boom or something like that, right? It kind of looks like a little torpedo, kind of, right? And then you're gonna have your lavaliers, which would be like, you know, what we use or whatnot when we hook it up, but I know it's not working right now. So a lavalier is nice when, you know, you want to get crystal clear audio of just someone's voice and you don't want to pick up something else. A boom is gonna pick up everything, right? So if I point a boom at my face, it's not just gonna pick up what's coming from my voice, but it's gonna pick up like what's behind and a bit of the sides and like people knocking and tapping, but a lav's a bit more controlled. And that's usually what you'll see them use in like interviews and things like that on the news or elsewhere, right? So this is our example of, you know, key light, backlight, fill light, which also I don't really like this diagram. Typically your backlight quite literally is behind a subject, just kind of hidden, right? But what I can see what they're doing right now, if that's the case, is that backlight is just bouncing the light off of the white surface to kind of, you know, highlight the person from the back. And then your fill is getting the side of the keys, you know, from the top, so she doesn't get like shadows under her eyes or anything like that. So there is alternative lighting, right? 3 different types of lights that you'll mostly use with cameras. You have your on-camera flash. This is the most typical, popular flash that people are going to use, mostly for photography, which is what you guys would want to do. I don't quite know the technical jargon of flashes and what all they do, but the more money you spend, the more powerful the flash is, which gives you more light over your subject. And then you have your on-camera LED lights, which these are primarily going to be used for video because you want to provide like a constant stream of light over somebody. And with those, you can adjust the color temperature, the tint, things like that, depending on what model you have. A ring light is going to be perfect maybe if you're using your camera as a webcam and you're sitting down. A ring light's going to evenly diffuse light over your face. It's going to look soft, it's going to look nice, and, you know, make your face look very flattering if you're doing like at-home vlogs or something. And then these are going to be your microphones. You'll have your in-camera mic, which comes standard with just about any camera, right? It's not going to be that great, but it's always good to kind of have a backup in case your core and nice microphone audio doesn't work. Like in the case of this, we have like the webcam mic or something. Your wireless mics. I love the DJI ones that we sell. If you need microphones, they're very simple and like intuitive to use. And you'll typically plug a lavalier into one of those microphones, which just kind of clips on your shirt, right? Get a little bit more direction. Otherwise, they have one built in. Then you'll have your boom and your on-camera mic. Function the same, but typically in movies and stuff, you have that guy that probably has the best upper body strength in the world that has a big, like 12-foot tall pole hanging over something to get footage. So, and then we'll quickly talk about stabilizing your shot, which this is what you're mostly going to be dealing in with, you know, photographs. Right. You'll have your monopods, which they won't be as stable. I always like to say it's good to have a hand on them or whatnot, but very nice if you're just trying to quickly prop something up and kind of plant yourself in there. Just like if you think we talked about kind of hugging yourself, sometimes you really need to get a good shot. Monopod is just kind of like a nice little version where you can kind of tilt it and things like that, and make sure your camera's even with the ground and whatnot. Then you'll have your tripods, which is what most people will do, which sometimes give you a little bit of control, kind of swivel in, adjust the height and things like that. It gives you the most stable position if you want to sit it up, take a photo, right? Then you'll have your video tripods. which these ones are usually going to be a lot heavier and bigger, but they give you a bit more control in terms of like swiveling and panning and things like that, and they'll be really smooth. So people that shoot video can get those nice little like tracking shots and things like that. Right. And then we'll have our gimbals. Our gimbals are going to be kind of like our portable stabilization, which once again is going to be more video oriented. A lot of people, like only what we sell is going to be our single-handed gimbals, right? So that'll be like our DJI Ronins and stuff. So people that quickly need something portable to kind of stabilize the shot, as opposed to the in-camera stabilization, will want that. And more professional stuff that you'll see at bigger camera stores and stuff you might use on movies or whatnot is all these kind of goofy little, two-handed gimbals or straps and things like that for more, professional work to give you a little bit more versatility in the shot. When you're setting the gimbal up, right, you'll want to configure your gimbal for the body and the lens, because it just needs to know how heavy everything is and what it needs to adjust things for and all that stuff. But the nice thing with gimbal, especially some of those DJI stuff, it lets you just kind of quickly pan or tilt or roll or do these cool flips. I've seen some cool little TikTok videos where they kind of start horizontally or something and they just flip it really quick because it has a motor and you can program it to do all these types of movements, right? Something that you can't always get with people because, we'll always kind of have a bit more of a jankier shot. These know how to get a really smooth look to them. But with that, that's going to be everything we have for traditional cameras. So if you have anything else, post-production related or anything, I can answer those now. But yeah,
Great.
Thank you guys. Unless there's anyone in the chat that has questions, I'll close this down in a few minutes, but I'll leave it up. So.
All right, well, I appreciate all your info.
You're welcome. Anytime.
I'm not a video person, but I liked all the photo stuff.
Yeah, I was like, all the photo stuff is useful, and if you have, any of you guys have any questions, you can always shoot me an email or something like that if you're trying to edit your photos and they look a little weird. So.
All right, well, thank you.
So I learned.
You got one more week, huh?
One more week. I won't be teaching next week because Saxon will be back, but this is my little fill for the time.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm running.
All right, sounds good. Well, it's good to see you. I'm sure I'll see you around walking around next week. So
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Bye. So I learned a few weeks ago, I
Mhm.
didn't realize I have been shooting with the SDHC card,
Mhm.
and he said I needed an SDXC
Mhm.
card.
Right.
What's the difference?
Yeah, there's going to be all these different formats for SD cards. SDXC is going to be just a little bit faster. So it'll have faster read and write speeds and stuff like that.
Even though I purchased like 300,
Mm-hmm.
but it was SDHC, not SDXC.
Yeah. Depending on what you're doing, like sometimes compatibility issues arise when using HD or XC or stuff like that. Even though they might be similar, like one card is still a bit faster because of the tech they use and whatnot. So, but SDXC isn't too much more than HC, depending on what brand you're looking at.
What is it, the Extreme, the SanDisk?
Oh, the SanDisk ones, yeah. Like I use SanDisk for mine too, and they have a nice. We talked about that before. They have a nice.
So if I have one, I bought one SDXC card, but I've spent so much money on this 300 SDHC.
I mean, necessarily, I don't know. It might just be because of, I know yours was higher megapixel. Doesn't mean that you have to necessarily get rid of them, but it just might be difficult to work with. The XC will give you a bit more wiggle room or whatnot in terms of taking those photos. And I think there's one above that for standard SD that would be the fastest. If you do that, you won't run into issues. So. Okay. All right. Well, cool. Thanks for stopping in. It was good to see you. Okay.
See you.
Thanks. All right. So, unless anyone else has some more questions, I'm going to close out for the day. Next week, Saxon will be talking about our, fourth camera class beyond the traditional camera. So if you have anything like GoPros, drones, things like that, that's where Saxon's, or 360 cameras, that's where Saxon's going to talk about all of that. But with that, I don't see any more comments in the chat, so I'm going to close out for the day. I thank all of you guys for stopping into the stream and checking in for Advanced Camera today. Have a good day, and